Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we're going to focus again on our registrant class, and we're going to talk about some potential changes we could make in our registrant class and discuss some of the pros and cons of doing so. So to begin with, we're going to focus on our getters and setters, and specifically on our setters. When we set up this registrant class, we simply made each one of our setters have a return value of void. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the benefits of considering perhaps an alternate return value. And so in this video, we're going to focus on our setActive, our setFirstname, and our setLastname. We don't have to worry about a set username because we said that once the object is constructed, we do not want the ability to change the username from outside of the class itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later video. So to begin with, let's talk about our setActive. You would argue that, first of all, it's rather restrictive. In other words, it only allows for you to change this .active to true, and perhaps you've made a mistake. In other words, so for some reason you want to then be able to change active to false. Well, how would we go about fixing this? Well, you've got a couple of options here. The first thing that you can do is you can actually go ahead and create a setActive and provide to it a bool or boolean, and again, just a local variable that we're going to call active. And then what we would do here is we'd simply say this .active is equal to active. And then this would allow you to change from true to false or false to true. So in other words, it just gives you a little bit more flexibility here. The thing to note, though, is that both of these setters can coexist. In other words, you can have a setActive that does not accept an input argument and a setActive that does. So in other words, setters fundamentally behave like other methods in that you can have overloads. At this point, then, what we want to do is we want to think a little bit now about that return value for the method. And for this discussion, then what we want to do is we're going to make some changes that if you choose to make these changes, you're going to want to make these all across the board, and you're going to want to make some changes inside your method. So what I encourage you to do is to follow along with me for the first couple of examples and then try to make those changes on your own to understand the difference. So fundamentally, we'll start now looking at our first name, our setFirstname, and our setLastname. And what we want to do is we want to think about mixing in a little bit of validation along with our setter. In other words, at this point, we could simply provide it with a valid first name in the constructor and then turn around and provide it with an invalid first name in a setter, essentially overriding good information. And we would not want to do that because at that point, then we could create an invalid registrant object. In other words, one in which the fields have values that don't make any sense. So we fundamentally have to do some error checking inside of each of the setters. But the problem is that the setter has no way to communicate back to the calling function whether or not the set was successful. Now, in an earlier video on the constructors, we saw that you have one option, and that is you could simply throw an exception. But I would like for us to explore a couple of options here, and I'm going to start off with our set first name. And so we need to consider doing some error checking. And then we've got some possibilities of throwing an exception if the first name is invalid. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take a second to rearrange this just a little bit so our pseudocode makes a little more sense. So if the first name is invalid, we can, of course, throw an exception. But what if we decided to change the return value for the setter? In other words, make it like another method. And so let's explore some options. Of course, we can leave it to be void, which is what we currently have. We can also consider having a Boolean value. Where true would be a successful set. And false, of course, would be unsuccessful. And a third alternative would be to match the return value with the data type of the set. In other words, if we pass it a string, it simply returns the string that it ultimately set the private field to. Again, we've got a couple of different options here. It allows for your calling function to validate whether or not this set was successful. And we're going to take a look at varying examples of this as we go through different projects. I'm going to keep this one simple. In other words, I'm going to focus on the Boolean value. In other words, what we're going to do now is we're going to change our public void to public Boolean. We're going to have set first name. Again, it's going to be the same function name or setter name. And again, we're going to pass a java.lang.string, and it will be first name. And then you'll probably be disappointed to know that you cannot change the return value between overloads. In other words, in our setActive, we could change which input arguments were provided. However, we cannot change what return values are provided. So in this case, we're going to have to make a wholesale change in our code. That was the reason I made the comment earlier that you probably want to watch along up to this point to see what I'm about to do here so that you can then do it in your own code. And so to begin with, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to comment out my original setter for the purposes of documenting what we're doing. And I'm going to simply replace it with the one that has a public Boolean set first name. Now what we're getting is a missing return statement, which we can easily handle here. And what we'll do is we'll throw a little bit of logic in here as well as a local variable. We're just going to call this one results because we've used that one before. And what we're going to do is we're going to assume naively that our results are going to be true. In other words, that our set will be successful. At this point, then we can simply fix the warning by saying return results. And then now we can focus at the task at hand of making sure that the first name is in fact valid. And so here we're simply going to have a check to see that our first name is not null or is equal to null, or that the first name length is equal to 0. And if either of those are true, then we simply set results equal to false. And then under the else branch, we set whatever the value was passed to our setter to the local field variable, in this case, this dot first name. And so if for some reason your calling function tries to pass a first name that's not valid, it will not overwrite the existing value. And in this case, our calling function will then get a false if a invalid first name is attempted to be set. So hopefully you can see some advantages of this approach. In other words, you can get more information back to the calling function without having to throw an exception. If you throw an exception, if you recall from our constructors, you have to have a try-catch block outside in your calling function. This, if anything, is a softer, more graceful way to fail at calling a setter. Again, we're going to make the same changes in our our setLastname. And so we'll make this one a little bit quicker here. We're going to have our Boolean results. We're going to start off rather optimistically to say that our results will be true. We'll check to see that our last name is null, or last name dot length equal to 0. And if either of those are true, we'll simply set results equal to false. Under the else branch is where we will set the new last name. And then the main thing that we want to do is change our signature now to reflect this. I'm going to leave the first one here, and I'm going to change this now from a void to a Boolean, and then return our results. Again, it's just simply a softer way to set or fail gracefully if we set the wrong value or an inappropriate value for our last name. Now, lastly, what we want to do is we want to come back up here to our setActive. We can talk a little bit about this as well here, although this one already starts off as a Boolean value. You could make a pretty strong case that what we would want to do once we have set the value of active, that we simply return another Boolean. And so in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to change our function signatures ever so slightly, but this time around, we're going to return this dot active, whatever that state might be. So in this case, it doesn't necessarily tell you whether we were successful at changing it. It simply tells you what the current value is after the change. Again, very subtle difference here. And so returns the current value after the change. And again, you can do this with strings or any other data type or class. And we would do the same thing now with the overload here for ours. So we have a public Boolean set active. In this case, we're going to pass the active status. We're going to comment out. And then we will return this dot active regardless of what the current state is. So again, a very subtle difference between the two. Here, this returns success or failure based on whether the first name was actually changed. Likewise with the last name. In the set active, it simply returns the new state of the active local field variable. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.